I felt like DeepSeek felt like a Sputnik moment in that sense. Like they used to be like the space race between America and Russia or the Soviet Union. And then the Russians launched Sputnik. The satellite, everybody in America panicked. And then after that, there's a big push to put a lot of money and then put a man on the moon.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, Sierra founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey Shiyan, how's life?
Happy New Year, Jeremy.
Oh, the Lunar New Year. I don't think
Yes.
it's Chinese New Year is no longer in vogue, I think, for 2025.
None of your PC stuff, okay? We are Chinese people. We can say Chinese New Year.
Thank you for the red packets for my kids. It was fun to receive them. And now I have to get into the process where I'm like, got to figure out to open it up, see how much, put equivalent amounts. I don't know, this is the classic parent stuff. So we want to talk about this year for 2025 has been a huge start, right? When we did our last recording a month ago, it was pretty much like the December timeline.
Yeah.
And our hopes and wishes for the year. And we talked about the e-fishery as well.
Yeah.
And now it seems, whoa.
I guess Trump came into office and then things just happened really fast.
So I think when we predicted that there was this acceleration, I frankly found that it accelerated faster than I thought, right? Because I felt like when I thought acceleration, I don't know, it wouldn't happen in week 1, right? But it did it all in day 1, actually.
I mean, I feel like they came in with a set of things they wanted to get done.
Yeah.
And they just went boom.
Yeah.
I have to say, taking over the Office of Personal Management,
Yeah.
and then the Treasury payment system, it makes sense, right?
Yeah. And you're taking over the HR and the finance of any company. You're effectively lifeblood, right? Because HR, you handle all people.
Yeah.
And finance, you handle
All payments.
So everything runs on those 2 things, right? Yeah. So I think the velocity is much higher because during this time frame, I would say on the economic front, like he proposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which obviously has huge impact on the manufacturing base.
Yeah.
And obviously, he also increased tariffs on China by effectively 50% because
Yeah.
10% tariff on top of an existing 20% tariff.
Yeah.
That went up even further.
Yep.
He closed the e-commerce loophole or exemption, depending on how you look at it, for e-commerce goods of China going to
Yep.
low-income and middle-class Americans.
Yeah.
So a lot of things have happened really fast.
Yeah, it is a little bit odd, right? Because one of the big reasons for people voting for Trump was cost of living and prices. And I read an analysis that said Temu and Shein, the postcodes that they send to are actually disproportionately low and middle income, which makes sense, right? Because they're cheap. And I think he's actually turning the screws on people who are suffering most from cost increases. But he came out and was like, some pain is going to happen. But I'm not really sure that the pain of that is actually going to lead to more manufacturing in the US.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting debate that happens. And for sure, I think we all know the impact, like you said, about the goods and so forth. If you're going to Costco and you buy maple syrup, a 20% tariff will increase.
Although
syrup,
they have a
20%.
30-day reprieve,
Yeah, they did. So
right? They were supposed to go into effect last Thursday.
yeah,
And both Canada and Mexico were able to get him to hold off for 30 days by essentially promising to do things that they were already doing.
yeah. And I think that's where the markets are trying to figure out, right? Is this part of a negotiating ploy or is this actually a systematic increase of tariff and tax structures, right? And I think the market is like swinging between those 2 points of view right now. Because if it's a structural tax increase by tariffs, then obviously it does have a very strong impact on the value flows between importers and exporters within the American economy, right? Versus if it's a negotiating ploy, then fine, then it doesn't structurally change the economic.
Yeah. But I think if you look at the difference between the first Trump administration and today, right, the trade surplus with China has gone down, but the trade deficit with Mexico and Canada has actually gone up, right? So it's going to be an even bigger impact on the US economy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I think just today they announced that Trump was like saying perhaps there can be tariffs on Japan as well. So I think basically the entire world is basically going line by line. And I think EU is waiting for the shoe to drop as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does that mean for technology?
I think the question on whether some of these restrictions have worked or not has been blown up by the DeepSeek news, right? So the idea was like, hey, we're going to stop China from getting access to the best NVIDIA chips and halt their progress. And then the news basically of DeepSeek's V3 reasoning model coming out and matching state-of-the-art at reportedly a much lower training cost, collective trillion-dollar freak out on the markets, right? I don't know. What does it mean for technology? I feel like the trade war tension is only going to get ratcheted up, right? Separate from tariffs, what other restrictions are going to be put in place? And yeah, the climate is just not, I don't know, man. The whole thing feels very insane.
It's definitely not an easy set because there's so many moving pieces that's happening, right? So if I was to go through that list, like for example, I felt like DeepSeek felt like a Sputnik moment in that sense. Like there used to be like the space race between America and Russia or the Soviet Union. And then the Russians launched Sputnik, the satellite, and then everybody in America panicked. And then after that, there's a big push to put a lot of money and then put a man on the moon.
But I don't think the money is an issue, right? And I think there's an open question about how big a deal it is, right? Because the one thing is that the DeepSeek team actually published, it's an open source model. Like you can go download it today on Hugging Face, right? Perplexity has already included it as an option in their search engine. And the techniques that they described, I think everyone will use from now on to reduce the cost of pre-training. Is it so surprising that a bunch of smart Chinese engineers and scientists could come up with ways to work around the constraints of lower powered NVIDIA chips? That's not actually that crazy an idea, right? You have 1 billion people. Amongst this 1 billion people, of whom many are very highly trained in STEM, would they not solve around that? And actually the fact that they didn't have access to H100s actually forced them to innovate around CUDA in order to get the kind of processing that they needed to do the calculations. And the fact that Americans have no problem getting the highest rated chips means that they weren't forced to do that, right? They didn't have to go and find that extra few turns of performance from somewhere. I mean, I don't know if it's a Sputnik moment because also those techniques will be copied by everyone, right? It's open source. And you can't just imagine that everyone else is dumb.
Yeah.
No, but it's a little bit like, did we talk about this last time about the Americans getting on Xiaohongshu and then seeing Chinese people and being like, oh wow, like your city looks pretty modern. Did you think we lived in a cave? What do you think's going on over here? I don't think the Valley has the monopoly on innovation or brains or ambition. And of course, things are going to happen all over the world and it's the constraints perhaps led to this.
No, I love what you said, which is from an American, if you look at it as an arms race in AI, which is the framing in the media today, they felt like having those export controls AI chips would prevent them from catching up. But like you said, actually, the evolutionary Darwinian approach is that if you created that constraint, people would design around that constraint. Which is that if America had let China use the most power-hungry chips, then probably we will probably see the latest iteration be a more powerful model, but probably be much more power intensive. So,
but it's who is it? It's like the Indian Space Agency, right? The Indian Space Agency actually is very well known for being very capital efficient, right? And building rockets that are cheaper and all this is like, well, why? It's like, well, they just don't have as much money. So they need to, right? So I do think that there is some aspect of that, but it's like a mad thing. But you were telling me about legislation banning DeepSeek today. And at first I thought you were just talking about the federal one where it's, oh, we're going to ban it on federal devices. You're like, yeah, okay, fine. Sure, right? Anyone who uses any sort of corporate device, half the things they're not allowed to use anyway, right? Great. Somebody has some sort of posturing bill to go ban it on federal devices. Why not? But I think there's actually a second piece of legislation which I hadn't read about yet.
Let me go get the numbers for you.
Because that one sounded much more aggressive.
Yeah, I think the Senator Josh Hawley proposed that if you use DeepSeek as an individual, you can have a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. And if a corporation uses DeepSeek, then the fine will be up to $100 billion for corporation. And I think the big problem, as you can tell, is that we don't know whether it will become legislation or not, but definitely it's within the Republican Party, it's a good shot of passing. It could potentially become bipartisan. And the potential nature of that does have a chilling effect that if I was an American company, I would be like, do I really want to build my technical roadmap on top of DeepSeek, right? Because if I use it, the technical infrastructure for it, I might have to re-engineer in 1 year's time when it does get passed.
Yeah, sure. But I feel like talking to people in the portfolio, like most people are actually building in a way that allows them to swap out the underlying models pretty easily.
Right.
And they do that anyway, right? They start with the frontier models, whether from Claude, from
Yeah.
Anthropic or OpenAI. And then as they learn more about how the application performs, they start to swap out with cheaper open source models, right? And they divide up the workload so that they're not spending so much on the frontier models, and they slowly swap smaller models or cheaper models through. I don't know. That feels just, I agree. On the margin, probably it makes you be like, do I really need this hassle in my life? But it's just like more posturing. It's so irritating.
Yeah, if you are a startup, you would be pushed to make it even more likely to be able swappable, right? Because
Yeah.
you just need that optionality,
Yeah.
which is probably one of the intended effects of even having the legislation come out with this. It's not a side effect, it is one of the main early effects of it. So I think the direction of travel is clear. Although I think I also like what you said was true, which is that even though it can be seen as Chinese, but it's also open source. And that open source, it was hosted on American open source platform and community.
When Perplexity rolled it out,
Yeah.
the marketing message was, this is the DeepSeek model hosted on American servers
Yeah.
with censorship controls removed.
Yeah.
So what are we even talking about?
Yeah, because it's open source, right? It's like weirdly also a victory of the American netizen internet principles of open source, right?
Well, I think
Linux and other folks.
Meta's
Yeah.
AI leader, Yann LeCun, was
Yeah.
like, this isn't about China versus India versus the US. It's actually about open source versus closed source. So he, of course, because Meta has been pushing open source with
Yeah.
their Lambda models and things like that. He's like, yeah, look, we can see everything, and everyone's going to take this stuff, and they're all going to improve and innovate with their models that way too.
I love what you say, which is that at the end of the day, it's open source versus closed source, right? And I think
Yeah.
the virtue of closed source is that somebody gets to control it, therefore the country can control it, right? It exists. If you have open source, then no country can control it by nature, which is the whole ethos of open source as well.
Yes.
It's just that open source used to be, I think it still is obviously American-led, American values, libertarian American like push, right? No? It's like me using Microsoft, and then sometimes I was using like Open Office.
I'm trying to think whether it is an American idea. Maybe. I feel like we have to do some research on what is the origins. I feel like I should
internet
probably...
originated in America. The early folks had a very
Yeah, but it was a
decentralized
DoD.
view.
The internet was a DoD project, right?
ARPANET. But
Yeah.
within that space, it was an open playground, and the open internet, net
Yeah.
neutrality. A lot of that stuff is, were we really debating this in Southeast Asia? No, definitely not. Has China been a big advocate of open source? No, historically, no.
Yeah.
EU, I think, is definitely following America's footsteps on this stuff. But I think I define America as a country, American as a governance and regulatory agency, America in terms of communities and like scientific
Yeah.
community. And then also there's American values, right, which is the culture and ethos, right? And those 4 very distinct layers, I would say, where we say something is American. So
America's a big country, right? There's a
Yeah.
fair amount of heterogeneity. All right, I'll concede
Yeah.
that. I'll allow it.
But I think what's interesting is that, yeah, like you said, DeepSeek is open source. And so it's on the open source servers. Everybody in America has access to it. A lot of startups are using the DeepSeek now. And then the economic market went through a downward turn because they digested the news, right? Which was like, one is we need potentially less GPUs than we thought. That's
Yeah.
one. 2 is we need less energy than we thought because it's
Yeah.
not energy efficient. And both of those things is NVIDIA and then obviously American energy companies.
Yeah. NVIDIA and the Magnificent Seven in general are like priced to perfection, right? They're trading at like historically high multiples, and a bunch of that was around like AI.
Mm.
And in general, though, when the cost of something goes down, there's a name for this, Jevons paradox or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's right.
It's actually, it grows demand for the thing rather than saying, so like you could debate about whether NVIDIA is fairly valued or not. But in terms of like the demand for the chips, I don't think that actually goes away. So it's
Yeah.
like item 1. I actually think if the cost of intelligence goes down, it just means that you can apply to way more things
Yeah.
economically if the demand for that thing goes up.
Yeah.
And then I think the second thing is I've read a few more technical papers about the cost, right? Because there's a big debate about, like, can we believe this cost estimate? Is it true? And they say this is the pre-training number. It doesn't include like all the R&D that was done before or whatever. And so if you think about pre-training as a percent of the total overall cost, it is not the 100% cost.
Yeah.
So there's still like the cost of inference and all these other things. And that still is going to require GPUs. And that next phase of development, I think, is going to become more important as models advance. So I just think on a demand side, from the demand side, I'm not actually that worried about demand for GPUs. I do think it begs the question of, okay, because I think all the tech companies reported in the last 10 days or so, did they need to be spending that much on CapEx? Could they use more effective ways to do it? Probably, right?
Mm.
If they probably start to move some of these techniques through to the stuff that they're building, maybe they'll save money that way. But they're all kind of in an arms race with each other, right? So it's also just that we've just pushed the frontier of what you can do here. We're going to implement that, but that doesn't mean that there isn't other stuff for us to keep trying to push the boundaries on and spending on.
Yeah. And I think this is actually a good parallel to the US broadband push, right? I think there was also a similar kind of like push where everybody was building broadband and they were pushing really aggressively, huge overinvestment, but it was an arms race.
Yeah.
And the winners were the ones who did overinvest
And didn't
the
die.
most. So the tricky part is, if you
Don't die.
overinvested the most and you didn't die,
You can
then you got a
last
sweet
long
spot.
enough for the
And then you sweat everybody
demand.
else. Those who overinvested and died got killed, and those who underinvested and survived ended up dying and
Yeah.
eaten anyway.
Yeah.
So it was like the sweet spot Goldilocks of like, how do you overinvest but also raise enough capital so that we don't die, and then we eat everybody else and consolidate that.
And maybe overinvest is not the right word, but you're basically investing ahead of demand.
Yeah. So I don't think overinvest implies a negative
Yeah.
thing, but you are
It's
investing
like a
way ahead.
time.
Yeah.
It's a time problem.
It's like railroads, right? Like once upon a time, all the railroad barons were like, let's overinvest in railroads, right? And they were investing
Yeah.
ahead of demand.
Yeah.
And then they built all the track. And if we look at today, everybody's like, America, there could be more railways. But it just happened to over-invest at that point of time versus what they had.
Yeah.
That was interesting dynamic for infrastructure. And I think it's key, which is, I like what you said about it, is AI is a commodity, right? And the more and cheaper we get it, the more people are going to use it. So maybe economical to use, like we talked about AI teddy bears, right? In the past, the compute wouldn't have made it because you'd be like, oh, the subscription cost of this AI teddy bear will be $10 per month. It's too expensive to have this AI teddy bear. But now you're like, oh, with DeepSeek and the way it is done, you can imagine a scenario where you're like, it's preloaded with enough whatever, and it's a one-time cost. It's $10 one-time cost, right? To the teddy bear.
Yeah. I think you'll just end up applying it to like lots of stuff, right?
You have a talking tree. You can have a talking chair. And let's say you can have a talking hat. I think when you talk about cheap, that's what we're getting to it.
Yeah. I have a very silly example. When you go to Sushi Row, the conveyor belt sushi, and every plate is chipped. But do you remember when RFID chips first came out? They were very expensive. And then they're like, how would you ever use this thing? It's so expensive.
Yeah, I remember all those crazy founders are talking about RFID chips are the future. And then everyone's like, why would we use RFID?
Now they're in every plate at Sushi Row. And at the end of your meal, the person just comes and boop, 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 scans your stack of plates and then gives you your bill.
Crazy, right?
It's
So
like
they
a
were
very
right, but
trivial example.
no, but the thing is like the founders that were doing RFID, I remember now for those days, they were right. It's just that, of course, the question was
Too
what
early.
kind of, well, it was too early, but two was what's the business model, right? Can you imagine their business model was like every sushi plate will have RFID. Then everybody would just laugh at them and say like, what are you talking about? It's too cheap, such a low value, blah, blah, blah. But if you think about it, somebody made money selling RFID sushi plates.
Yeah, it's just, but it's all labor savings, right? That's what it is. But I think every book in the National Library is RFID tagged. When you
Most
return
trees in
it-
Singapore are also tagged
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, because when you return the library books, right?
Yeah.
It just knows what you have. And I don't know why I suddenly thought about Sushi Row. It's the weekend. I have to deal with my kids, but
No, we're just talking about the fact that the cost of compute is dropping, and it's getting to the point now that it's going to be a big thing cost. And it reminds me of a sudden of that like Beauty and the Beast, where the teacups, every teacup has a voice and personality. They all dance at the candlestick, the clock.
yeah.
And you're like, wait a moment, we can totally do that now. I'm just saying, is this cheap enough where you're like,
Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
wouldn't you want to like have a tea set and coffee set and all them all talking to each other and having a very dramatic Korean drama style debate with one another about who's getting the coffee and who's pouring the tea? If you think about it, we now, because of DeepSeek and the AI boom, you're like, wait a moment, it probably costs you like maybe like $100 to do it, right? Because it's just like a small speaker for each one of them. And then you put a Wi-Fi signal and then you run it through DeepSeek and you'll be like, oh, I recreated Beauty and Beast.
My house is noisy enough. I don't need my teacups and
You
my
old
pot
person.
to talk to me or to each other. Like,
You're gonna be disrupted by the future. They're like bifocals, and you're like looking at some print newspaper.
hey, don't make fun of me, okay? I'm probably about at that level. I need to get bifocals. I was like, oh man, opium is setting in. Why can't I read this small text anymore?
Now imagine at your breakfast table, you have your 7 teacups, and every plate is talking to each other. And while they're talking to each other, they also read the news to you. See, there you go. And you know what? This is gonna become a product actually, like a Beauty and the Beast talking tea set.
I'm sure Disney's already working on it.
Everybody's doing it. You know what? It's totally doable, right? Anyway, such a novelty gift, can you imagine? But yeah, it's possible now. It's just that the AI model will be proudly made in America. That's the difference for the Disney one, right? You know what I mean? It'll keep the censorship and profanity modules installed. Sorry, I just imagine.
You are really into this teapot thing.
I know. I'm just like, can't. Okay, I think somebody's gonna make it. So why not?
For sure. And I think
Yeah.
somebody is working on the AI stuffed animal stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of
So-
them just working. on
Yeah,
stuff
yeah,
anymore.
it's totally a thing.
So now we're just brainstorming so that when it does happen, we were like, oh,
Oh,
it's
we
predicted
already
it.
thought about that.
We were like, just too lazy to do it ourselves and make bank on it. We just speculated for fun, right? I guess another question that I was thinking about is, okay, so what does that mean, right? Because we saw the acceleration of geopolitics, I think, in January, since the January 6th inauguration. So I'm just saying, like, the piece that I'm thinking about is, I think one piece is that I think the anti-China or the decoupling will accelerate even faster than I had thought even
Yeah.
1 month ago.
Yeah.
And I think the writing on the wall is quite clear for every Chinese national founder out there.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's going to be faster than I thought.
Mm.
I think the writing on the wall was pretty clear, right?
Yeah.
'Cause it started in the first Trump administration and then continued, Biden's policies continued there. I do think that that is something the Chinese founders have to continue to think about. Because I guess the other side to take on this Trump stuff is like, all of this stuff he's doing by executive order rather than doing through legislation. He doesn't want to make things more permanent or pass legislation. Or he like,
Mm.
doesn't want to deal with Congress. He just
Mm.
wants to be like, do this. And he's like a mercurial person. I think there's a little bit of let's wait and see what happens. Like it hasn't actually written into law yet.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I just feel like whatever impact it has, 4 years is a long time. It's forever in startup years. There's nothing you can do. Actually, one interesting thing that I talked to some Chinese founders about this is that for the smaller Chinese founders, they're actually okay with some of these changes because the large Chinese players like Temu and Shein, like all those companies, were doing well under the old regime, or whatever you want to call it, by the old set of policies. And so to some extent, Trump's changes, rewards, for example, Chinese founders who are willing to move to Mexico, or smaller outfits that are willing to be more nimble, because a lot of the pain, for example, on closing the minimis bracket for e-commerce goods, it impacts Temu, it puts Shein. For smaller e-commerce, somebody else's problems at the top is at least a way to change the game for my current dynamics.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's an interesting point of view, which
Yeah.
is it's all aimed at incumbents. And so if you're a small startup, you benefit because your big Goliath is occupied.
I think another thing that happened that I didn't expect as much as personally was that I think crypto made a big comeback.
Heading
So
into the next bull market. You ready?
I think we saw that Trump actually went towards pro-crypto perhaps in about Q3 last year as individuals, but people felt like it was primarily were pushing back against Biden and Kamala for being anti-crypto rather than Trump being pro-crypto. And then I think in January we saw Trump launch the Trump coin, and then it promised to be the most pro-crypto administration, and then
There's also this
SEC.
like strategic Bitcoin reserve proposal. Did you see that one?
Yeah, if the government is buying, then obviously it's like the oil market, the prices will rise. There's a lot of support supposedly, right, for
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the general like deregulation
yeah,
move, right? Which is we want to be the center of financial markets, right? So we're gonna like, and there's people in the administration who are pro crypto. He has a crypto czar, right,
Mm,
David
yeah.
Sachs, but even before, right, you can already see some of this stuff opening up with the ETFs being approved and things like that. I think, yeah, like I think the mood is good, but I think partially also the crypto market has matured a little bit, right, with the many more sort of the stable coin use cases and things like that. But yeah, the Trump coin actually seems quite ridiculous to me. Can you imagine any other political leader like on the
Lee Kuan Yew coin.
on the eve of like basically coming into power,
yeah.
launching,
Lawrence Wong coin. There you go.
but he's the beneficiary of it, right? Anybody who buys that thing,
Yeah.
and the company that did it was based out of Singapore.
Oh, really?
And but I think that is actually quite. You want to talk about conflicts of interest, like launching a coin for your own, and Melania has a coin. The whole thing is just insane.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I think it does have an impact on Southeast Asia crypto from my perspective. So I think that when the Biden administration was more anti-crypto from the perspective of the crypto community, and obviously China banned crypto as well, then Singapore was seen as a neutral place as well as Dubai.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that I think now that Trump is pro-crypto, I think there's going to be a move from my perspective of the more American-affiliated crypto companies, I think back to America perhaps, because they might domicile, for example, in Texas or Nevada rather than Delaware. I think there's a certain stack where you can see them, and they still have some optionality, obviously, between different geographies, just in case the next administration is a Democratic administration that's anti-crypto again. But I just think that there's going to be that move of crypto talent there. And I think the Chinese seller will still continue to be in Singapore and Dubai because I don't think they feel too welcome in the US. But you can also imagine the regional crypto folks might just move to the US as well, rather than move to Singapore. So I think Singapore's crypto hub that really existed as a regulatory alternative alongside Dubai, I think both of these alternatives have decreased in terms of value to a crypto business.
Yeah, but it takes time, right? I think part of it was that there wasn't a lot, like, it was like regulatory confusion, right? It was like, is this legal? Is this not legal? What's going on? So it'll take time to actually put in, I think, like clearer regulatory guidance.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Like probably on margin, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's going to be interesting as well in the coming year is I think that a lot of the Chinese companies are going to start really aggressively pushing Southeast Asia as growth markets rather than the US. I think a lot of the Chinese folks were like, they think that Trump is obviously not friendly to China, but they've had a wait and see approach. And then Trump really came out strong and raised tariffs by 50%. So from their perspective. So I think it was just, okay, got it. The message is we better make it work in EU or Southeast Asia.
Yeah. I go back to the US end of next month, and so I'll want to see what the temperature is.
Wrapping up things here, from your perspective, is what's the one thing that you hope happens in Southeast Asia tech in the next month? Obviously, we're looking at the whole region, and I think the big piece of news as well for the Southeast Asia tech ecosystem is that the Grab and Gojek/GoTo merger acquisitions talks apparently have been leaked to be said they're ongoing with a target for the deal to be done this year.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This isn't a new rumor, right? There have been talks about this a number of times in the past. And so I think there is some commercial logic to it, right? Is to consolidate these players, remove a fair amount of the cost structure because they compete in the same markets, but they are strong in different markets, right?
Yeah.
And so to be able to eliminate one layer of competition. I guess my question is it anti-competitive?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the question I'm sure that the regulator is going to have. Between the two companies, Grab is in a stronger position. The enterprise value in terms of its core profitability, whereas Gojek is still losing money.
Yeah.
So frankly, this is more of an acquisition than a true merger of equals. It's acquisition of Grab or Gojek. But so the Singapore regulator is going to be okay from my perspective, and from my experience doing M&A. And I think the Indonesian regulator is going to be the question mark about that. But I think that's where I think some of the optics are going to be very key, like saying there's a merger rather than acquisition. I think the optics around maybe some of the commitments to preserve jobs in Indonesia would be an important part to allay the Indonesia regulator. Maybe also talking about service levels or even price levels. It's going to be right because, if you look at where Grab and Gojek are competing, they're primarily competing in the Indonesia market, and both of them therefore are keeping prices relatively low. But if Grab and Gojek kind of merge as a service, then as a primary player, the prices can rise. And then I think from a regulator perspective, that would be quite problematic from their perspective, right? So that maybe I can imagine some level of commitment to be like, we're not going to change prices maybe for the next 5 years.
I mean, it's not like they're the only people, right? There's still taxis. Bluebird is a big player, and there's a bunch of other. Yeah. They're just the big, like, ride-hailing.
Yeah.
And I think there's a couple of Vietnamese players that entered that market as well, right? They're trying to go regional.
Yeah, so you can imagine a scenario where, and I have no access to any of this private information, but you can imagine that Gojek will also be fielding opportunities, talking to Bluebird and these Vietnamese companies, just be like, does that level of integration make sense as an alternative? Because you never want to be an M&A conversation with only one party. But of course, who's going to have the money to pay and streamline? But like you said, the economic part of it is you have two major ride-hailing companies that are highly duplicative in terms of their marketing and their infrastructure stack. They can save a lot of money just by consolidating. So,
but if they have to make concessions on the Indonesian jobs and all that sort of stuff, then does the math still pencil out?
I think it pencils out from the Grab perspective, right? Because it's just a 10-year horizon, and then you continue being a super app, you make money on other things as well. Because I think the transportation side is the most sensitive bit. But if you raise prices on food delivery or some other adjacent parcel delivery, I think people are not going to be as politically sensitive about that point. And of course, I think driver salaries is going to be a big part of it as well. So I think it's going to be interesting because these rumors have been happening for a long time, right? Truth is, SoftBank has been pushing both of them for a long time to do. Had investments in Uber, Gojek, in Grab. And they were the ones who told Grab and Uber and said, hey, Uber, you need to stop competing with Grab in Singapore because both of you are going to a price war to share a lot of value as a VC in both of them. So Uber should exit so that Grab can go up. Obviously, what Uber's management thought about this is a different thing, but from SoftBank's perspective, is less competition, makes it easier to rise. At that time, they said no to SoftBank because the two CEOs could not agree who was to be a CEO. But now I think it's totally different.
Because the founders are out.
For Gojek is
Yeah.
out. So right now it's Patrick from Northstar who's committed to be leading Gojek till 2029.
Yeah.
But of course, when he says he's only there till 2029, then obviously the question is like, what happens in 2030? And so I think some of this timeline is less emotional. It's just going to be more like there is synergy, there's cost savings,
Yeah.
there's revenue opportunity, there's the value, how do we slice the pie? And I think the issue that we have is that Gojek doesn't have as many alternatives because Grab can keep growing,
Yeah.
but Gojek is going to find it more difficult. So I think, to me, I think that's where the struggle is from the Gojek perspective. Is how do I get the best transaction price out of this relatively like single buyer auction, which is not.
And they have the same color, so it should be easy. Brand assets perspective.
Your cost saving, we're just going to put white tape for your bag. We're not even going to change the color. That's how cheap we're going to be. Elon Musk style is like, we're not going to buy new swag with this. We're just going to use a crayon and this is a draw on the back. Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a big piece. So what would the impact be? I think Grab as the bigger player with the high enterprise value is the acquirer. So the question is, will they overpay? I think this is a market perspective, so we don't know that. Is less competition in the Indonesia side, so we should expect that over the medium to long term, prices will rise for Indonesian consumers, or you can also make the argument that driver salaries will stay stagnant in the Indonesian market. Gojek already exited from Vietnam. So Vietnamese consumer has already been no more impact from this piece. So it's really, I think, the Indonesia consumer that's being impacted. Maybe
they don't have much here.
Singapore, it's not much, it's a small piece as well. So it's primarily, I see some Singaporean people, they check between Gojek and Grab and ComfortDelGro. But I think now that Gojek's out, this is going to be back to ComfortDelGro and Grab. And Grab also pulls taxis from ComfortDelGro. So they're both like same fleet, different apps with different margin structures. Anyway, I think you can expect maybe some small rise maybe in Singapore prices.
They've already gone up, right?
Yeah.
They've already gone up a lot. Take Grab that much anymore.
Yeah. I definitely been a few times where I was like, I'd rather drive and listen to something, or sometimes I'm just like, you know what? I'd rather take the bus.
Especially peak period.
Yeah.
Like yesterday, I was going from one meeting to dinner, and it was both downtown, right? And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna take the MRT and walk because it's gonna be super expensive and very crowded. Yeah,
you're gonna save a 40-minute trip to 20-minute trip, and then your price difference is gonna be effectively $40 versus $1 on the train.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get in 2,000 steps or whatever.
Yeah, your health and everything.
End of the day, get a bit of walking in, not so bad.
Yeah, peak hours, like
it's stupid.
$2 per minute. $2 per minute saved from my perspective, which is crazy. That's $120 per hour salary equivalent. So you better be doing something massively more productive.
But it's like gotten really expensive for a peak period. So I was like, all right.
But when I was in SF in January as well, Uber is also more expensive now as well. So I think this is a function of labor, right? If you're a lot cheap labor,
Waymo
it's cheaper. Yeah, so exactly.
But Waymo is not that much cheaper. It's a little bit cheaper. No, but you get novelty value.
Waymo strategy is price skipping, right? Similar to like the lab or cultured diamond market, right? If you have natural diamonds that are very expensive and you have a lab diamond, would you price it as very cheap? No, you're going to price it as 5 to 10% cheaper than a normal diamond. And then people start switching because there's enough of a price difference to get a better stone. And then the next step is after that, you drop it by another 10%. And so the price drop happens, a price war happens, but people are trying to skim that curve. So it takes 10 years to really see that full price drop. So that during this time period, the lab diamonds can extract as much value as they can. Does it make sense? Skimming off the natural diamonds. So the natural diamonds never move. Yeah. Only lab diamonds are moving, but at least you have the price premium. So I think same thing for Waymo is they have no need to set the prices massively cheaper. As long as slightly 10% cheaper than Uber, then people switch. That's what we saw in Grab and Gojek. Because if you're 10% cheaper, people just switch anyway. So you don't need to go like a massively cheaper. But yes, eventually I think self-driving cars will be the way to get it really cheap.
You don't want it because once again, then it leads to overconsumption.
Yeah, and also if you make it too cheap, then governments will be very angry because a lot of these drivers are low-income folks. So you're disrupting the taxi fleet, right? Yeah. Which is still a relatively protected class in many countries. Yeah. So, and I think that's what happened in Chinatown in SF, right? Like they burned a Waymo robo-taxi and set a fire and hit it with a bunch of rods.
But if you think that's the future, then maybe you shouldn't give out new taxi licenses.
As a government?
Yeah, like because it's like older people basically. So it's like employment of last resort, and so maybe it's okay. Like you just let that population naturally attrit out, but don't enable new people, and then you slowly implement self-driving cars.
Yeah, and I see that argument internally. I'm sure people are arguing about that internally. Of course, from my perspective, is we also don't know how long the robo-taxi curve is going to take.
They work. They're licensing it, right? Waymo's licensing it to Uber in Austin. You can start doing it today, basically.
Yeah.
And I would make the argument, I don't know though, but there's like young people who are Grab drivers. And I guess there's a question, which is that the best, most productive job they could be having?
This is where Singapore government for Skills Future to be future-proof your career. I always love the phrase future-proof. It's such a Singaporean phrase, like making yourself invulnerable against the future. I always found it such an interesting phrase that only exists in Singapore.
Only Singaporeans use
Did you ever heard a SF person say, I'm going to future-proof my career? No, right? Because they're like, my job is to be tech. My job is to disrupt people. Why would I want to future-proof myself, right? Isn't such a Singaporean phrase?
I guess so.
I've never heard anybody say that they want to future-proof themselves. Say, if I was in America, I say I want to bulletproof myself.
Yeah.
Makes total sense because bullets in America. But nobody in Singapore says bulletproof. It'd be crazy. I want a bulletproof car. I was like, what? Why? That's crazy, right? Anyway, I just find it interesting that in America, I don't think you're going to hear anybody say they're going to future-proof themselves. But anyway.
Thank you for my fun fact of the day, Jeremy.
On that note, let's wrap things up and I'll see you next month.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.